And thank you to the organizers for having me here. I think the first crucial point is that there is a emerging architecture unfolding in the region, and which will crystallize in the near future. When I hear commentators, analysts, scholars talk about regional powers being able to shape things, to come to agreement and forge some kind of structure, I'm rather skeptical. Simply because of the way things have evolved over the past 5, 6, maybe 10 years. The traditional powers, the centralized governments, the elites, so to speak, becoming increasingly disconnected from the realities on the ground. Their ability to shape things on the ground in Iraq, in Syria, is becoming increasingly difficult. And that's because within this architecture which is emerging, it is, of course, armed groups shaping the reality, shaping the society, the fabric of society. These groups have become administrators of territory. They have substantial local resources. They're no longer dependent on foreign powers or external powers as they used to be. They have their own autonomous networks of financing, of resources. They have the benefit, of course, of social media, which enables them to mobilize people, to recruit supporters, to affect change by way of propaganda, discourse. These groups are becoming increasingly sophisticated. They are producing magazines, journals, and I'm talking not just about Iraq, but also Syria as well. So what does all this mean for the future? I think it means we have to be more creative about how we approach the challenges, the problems the region has, these countries have. Unfortunately, the way the system is organized internationally is that we're used to picking up the phone, speaking to a prime minister in Baghdad, or the president, speaking to the government, the centralized government in Syria, and getting what we want to achieve done. That is no longer the reality. If the Turkish government wants to resolve a problem in southern Iraq, for example, even Baghdad, it will be wasting its time if it speaks to the central government, if it speaks to Prime Minister Abadi, because it's not Prime Minister Abadi that is in a position to offer anything. It's actually this Shia militia group, that Shia militia group, or this armed group, or even this tribe. The armed groups in the region, of course, they are defined or called different things depending on your perspective. Some people call them militias, paramilitaries. They can be called armed tribes, secessionist movements, nationalists, warlords, of course, which is something to watch out for in Syria. And there is already a sub-regional arrangement or structure taking place. As we speak, Turkey is enhancing its ties with Qatar, for example. It's building a military base there. It's enhancing its ties with the Gulf by way of its relationship with Qatar. Turkey is also strengthening its alliance with the KRG, or the Kurdistan region, a crucial pillar of its security strategy for the region. It's strengthening alliances with various Arab Sunni factions in northern Iraq in preparation for the post-ISIS Iraq, in preparation for the post-ISIS or post-Raqqa Syria. On the other side, Iran is consolidating its position in Iraq. We've all heard about the Hashd al-Sha'bi and how much of a presence they've established in Iraq. Recently, the Hashd law was passed. That's consolidation of influence. That's legalizing the presence of these armed groups so as to sustain them post the military campaigns in Iraq and in Syria. And of course, I believe we will see similar changes taking place in Syria. The plethora of armed groups and militias supported by Iran, supported by other actors, local or regional, post-Raqqa, they will also be organized into some kind of institution. Iran will continue to consolidate its position in Iraq, in Syria, by way of economic measures, cultural ties, and so forth. So we're already seeing conflicting sub-regional structures emerging before we should even begin to discuss the prospects of a region-wide security architecture. This is where the focus should be for now. To answer your question specifically on the Kurds, I think one of the lessons that I believe from my research that certain groups are starting to learn from the Kurds is that historically the Kurdish national movement has sought international recognition, international legitimacy, and it's achieved this very successfully by speaking the language of democracy, of the rule of law, by aspiring to become integrated into the international system. And we're seeing similar groups, such as, for example, based on my research, such as the various Shia militias in Iraq. They're starting to interact increasingly with Western governments. They are starting to approach humanitarian organizations to strengthen their credentials, so to speak. In this uncertain environment, of course, it's easy to make alliances with the Kurds in Iraq. It's easy to make alliances with the Kurds in Syria. They're Western friendly, as I said. They speak the language of democracy. They speak the language of human rights. That makes them much more acceptable to Western audiences, and therefore easy allies to have. And I think the fundamental question is, why does all this really matter in the broader scheme of things? And that's because, as we heard from the previous panel, these countries, not just Iraq and Syria, but also parts of North Africa as well, they are going to need substantial money, resources, support post-conflict. Well, we no longer live in a regional order or global order where resources are in abundance. They are becoming increasingly scarce. There is reluctance on the part of international organizations, on the part of the international community to invest money and energy in what, for example, some within the Trump administration would say is useless state-building initiatives. That means the region will be left to its own devices. And the fundamental question when it comes to armed groups, non-state actors, when it comes to de facto states like Kurdistan, it's, well, if you're a business and you want to exploit the commercial opportunities in these various parts, how do you do so? These regions, they need money. Businesses can help with the rehabilitation of destroyed towns and cities, but from their perspective, the problem is one of legality and regulations. There isn't a system, so to speak, which enables them to go into these areas with confidence. The same applies to humanitarian organizations. They need access to these areas. They need to know and understand the various armed groups in these countries in order to have access to the populations that need their support. And of course, the same applies to governments, because, as I said earlier, the ability to look beyond the current system is not just there yet. So we need creative, outside-the-box thinking in order to move forward.
Thank you, sir.